in terms of being able to really benefit from its investment.
So really the idea that it be long term and I mean I would assume there could be nothing but benefit in ensuring that other levels of government are able to access those same resources and build those relationships, those long-term relationships.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I will say it's very common to see disruptions to trade, and it impacts different parts of the country differently. And we really kind of pride ourselves in being able to pivot to really optimize the situations and the conditions that we're dealt with.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm used to seeing you over on the other side in Fisheries Committee. So I represent, for those who don't know, one of the, in my view, and I think statistically true, one of the most important fishing ridings in the country, the South Shore of Nova Scotia. So everyone, I think, who knows that will be shocked to learn that most of my questions here from Mr. Landenbergen, who is a regular at the Fisheries Committee where I'm a member. 80% of what we catch in wild seafood is exported. 70% of what we consume is imported. That seems to be a strange combination that we all grapple with. But there is high demand, obviously, in Asia for our seafood products, and it has grown over the years. I'd just like to talk a bit about that challenge on diversification, because as China in particular engages in buying up businesses in Canada and everywhere in the world, one of the ways they're getting access to our seafood products is actually buying up those who buy the fish from the fishermen so that they can control the where it goes and being exported. And we have a particular challenge in Nova Scotia where they also control the live seafood export facility at the Halifax Airport run by First Catch. So I'm just wondering, how is it, and how, as one of the spokesmen for industry, the industry that's so important, you can diversify within the region when one particular member is actually sort of doing an end around and trying to get control of the supply chain in Canada, and we're letting it happen.
That's a very good question, Mr. Chair. In terms of diversification, I think in our sector more than many others, the customer-supplier relationship really is so personal. Others have talked about long-term benefits of having an office in country. Many of our bigger companies, they have sales people in country, in China, in US, in Japan, in Europe, and other countries in Asia. We need more to do that. Some of it is through marketing agents as well. And some of our members, they're traveling months and months of the year to meet with their customers. So I think that is really important. How we manage China or other companies, and whether they be state-owned companies or not, how they buy up and invest in our industry needs to be balanced. Sometimes companies, regardless of how they're owned, are good actors and others are not. And so we have to balance that with the rules that we have in place. And the Canada Investment Act might not necessarily be good enough for our sector.
You should know that we've changed, thanks to amendments I made to the Canada Investment Act that have just been proclaimed, that the threshold for state-owned enterprises for countries we don't have a bilateral relationship with, the threshold for review by Investment Canada is now $0. In other words, every acquisition can get reviewed. But were you consulted, or your organization consulted, on the development of this strategy?
On the Indo-Pacific strategy, yes.
And do you see any of what the industry needs reflected in the strategy?
Really, I think the difficult part for us, because for agri-food, a lot of the strategy was driven by Agriculture Canada, that seafood is a small part of the broader portfolio. And so we were very pleased to be consulted, to be invited to participate in the industry working group.
Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, particularly in the international oceans, is a major issue, particularly in Asia. How is it possible to have a successful Indo-Pacific strategy if the countries from that region are breaking most international rules in their fishing in international waters and what they do with that product?
To really tackle IUU fishing, and we recognize there are definitely hotspots, much as you just said, it's multifaceted and it takes every country and certainly every major seafood consuming jurisdiction to do to use multi tools to address that, whether it be the Port States Measures Act or other specific issues to really try and prevent IUU products from getting into market.
Does the strategy address that at all?
I'd have to take a closer look, but I would think it would be a minor part of the overall strategy because, again, seafood is a small part of it. There's other tools that governments have.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Looks like we'll have to have Mr. Landsberg and come back to our committee to have this discussion a little bit further then. Let's go to Mr. Erskine Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to ask my questions of Ms. Joseph, and I want to get at the role of LNG and I suppose natural gas in general, in your view, not just in the short term, but the long term. Because when we talk about a business case for natural gas, are we talking about it in the context of a net zero world?
Yes. So, Japan has the same climate targets, very similar climate targets as Canada, as does South Korea. But, as I pointed out in my comments, those are countries that import over close to 90% of their energy. And for them, security supply is a huge issue. And while all of them are looking at diverse energy sources like integration of wind, solar, et cetera, integration of hydrogen, the supply isn't there yet. Renewables need to be backstopped.
Well, not yet. But so I'm not talking about the next few years, and security in the short term is different from net zero in the long term.
Sure.
And so when we think of a net zero world by 2050, what role do you see for natural gas?
So I don't think 2050 is that long term away in terms of, how fast energy systems change. Canada has, increased its electricity supply domestically by 9% between 2005 and 2022. Some of these countries, as I mentioned, are just trying to get their societies electrified, period, let alone electrify sectors that have never been electrified, let alone maintain affordability of energy, et cetera. So 2050, I don't think is the timeline for natural gas to not be needed. It's still going to be critically important, including for the integration of renewables.
So on that, this is not me saying this. This is the International Energy Agency. They've got three different scenarios. They've got a stated policy scenario, in which case we do see an increase. So if just the policies that are announced today and in place today, if they stay today, then we're going to see an increase in natural gas from 3,900 billion cubic meters to 5,700 by 2050. In the announced pledges, though, countries that have just announced their targets, they've got to implement them. We see a slight increase and then flatlining all the way to 2050. We don't see a major increase to 2050. But here's what I want to ask you about. In the net zero scenario, we see a 55% decline in natural gas demand. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a model of what a world could look like in one version of getting to net zero. And that's true for the Canada Energy Regulator scenario as well. But those scenarios also anticipate an overall decline in energy use, which we are not on track for, especially as, the continent
No,
of
but
Africa.
us being on track to something is different from getting to net zero. We are not on track to getting to net zero. But this is, I think, the core question. If we work towards a world that is net zero, if we're committed to that, what is the role for natural gas? And if you disagree with the IEA, it's not a 55% decline. What decline is it in your view?
I don't know what the number is. The number is going to depend on alternative sources of energy being available to countries to provide their populations with affordable energy. And until those other sources of supply ramp up,
but
it's a guess. The IEA is guessing too.
But it's not an answer on net zero, right? Because you're talking about...
It's an answer on net zero, talking about the things energy needs to deliver for people. And the IEA is projecting that. I don't have the answer to what the world...
So it's an answer to delivering affordable energy potentially, but it's not an answer to net zero.
Okay.
Now, what the IEA will say, or what they do say, is the electricity sector will be the first to achieve net zero emissions, mainly because of the low cost, widespread policy support, and maturity of an array of renewable energy technologies. And electricity renewables are going to make up 90% by 2050 on the IEA's analysis. So it's hard for me, I suppose, to take altogether seriously the role that natural gas is to play by 2050 if I'm looking at modeled costed numbers from the IEA, and the answer back on your end where there's a business case is to say, but we don't know.
I guess I would just point out that it's modeled, but when you look at what's actually happening in the world, how fast you can do renewables penetration, the available of batteries that deal with intermittency. You can't do that. It's not, I don't know, it's 25 years. But 25 years.
But then you don't believe in a net zero world. But then you don't believe in a net zero world.
There can be a net zero world. I don't believe in your description.
Point of order, Chair.
Two things. First of all, when you both talk at once, it makes it impossible for our interpreters to keep up, okay? And secondly, Mr. Erskine-Smith, you are out of time. Let's go to, shall we, Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Well, it was quite a spectacle to listen to all of that without being able to chime in. Now, I'd like to thank my colleague, Yves Perron, for having been here this evening to support me during this particular meeting, which deals with agricultural issues that he's our critic on, and he's an expert on these matters. Now, I'd like to continue, Mr. Lansbury, along the same lines as Mr. Perron, regarding the fact that in many cases, producers prefer to export their commodities rather than having them consumed or used locally. First question, what could be done to address that? And secondly, we know that there's a whole host of products in Asian countries that are consumed there that we just quite simply don't eat here, and that are, in fact, thrown away in the ocean. Or how can we develop those markets? These are products that are less popular in the West, but may be very popular in the East. How can we further develop those markets? Well, thank you for the question.
Difficult one. Our sector is so fragmented, so diverse, with so many different species. It's very difficult for us to come together to have a national marketing campaign, much like you see with milk, chickens, eggs. We're not supply managed either, so we don't have a marketing levy that supports the marketing efforts. And so we, sometimes we rely on partnerships with some of the retailers to promote domestic product. I know in Quebec, Metro, which has a big presence in Quebec, they market Quebec products, Produit DC. And when I look at those flyers and in store, I'm proud of that. We need more of that, but it's a whole supply chain issue.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. That is your time, sir. We'll go to Ms. McPherson now for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think I'd like to continue on some of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Erskine-Smith, has been asking of Ms. Joseph. And it's interesting for me as well, listening to the back and forth, because I was part of a delegation that went and met with the German government last year, and they spoke about the desire for Canadian natural gas, but they also spoke about that as being a short-term thing, that they needed to help with the crisis in Ukraine, the illegal invasion by Russia, but there wasn't a long-term goal for them. That long term, they had much more interest in hydrogen, much more interest in renewables, much less interest in that. And yet the infrastructure to build so that we can actually develop these relationships on natural gas take a really long time, and they're extraordinarily expensive. And so if we had them, that would be one thing, but without the, I'm cautious about the idea of, being energy for a secure future, but it doesn't seem like you have as much openness to renewable energy, to the various forms of hydrogen. How does that fit into energy for a secure future in the region? And I also wanted to just point out too, it feels to me like we can't look at energy transition as like a straight trajectory. There is going to be a difference in how renewables come online, how actual, clean energy comes online, because I agree with you, we need energy for the world. I'm wondering if you could just respond to that.
Sure. So I 100% agree that, I've heard those same things from Germany, and every country's approach to both achieving their energy goals and their emissions targets are going to be different. And every country is starting somewhere different. And so I think we're very neutral as to how that's done. There are people within our network with a focus on hydrogen. There are people with our network on a focus in various types of energy overall. I spoke a lot about LNG because I think it is the resource where we have the capacity to meet the thing that is backstopping renewables now, not in Canada and internationally. That's something, Robert Johnston from Columbia University has highlighted. So it supports the transition. I think that LNG is something that people are signing contracts for into that time frame of 2050. And so is it us, or is it our LNG or someone else's, or are they going to be looking for baseload from other jurisdictions that are not us, or are they going to use more coal, which is what a lot of these countries have done, including Germany?
Or could we help them invest more in actual green energy and actual renewables that would help get those countries and would provide those opportunities for Canada as well?
We will have to leave the answer to that.
Out of time,
yes,
however,
you are
because
out
I
of
have
time.
a short window.
Yeah, well, as the evening goes on, everybody gets more energetic. This is very good. So this is what we're going to do. In the time remaining, we'll go to Mr. Couric, Mr. Oliphant, then back to Mr. Bergeron and Ms. McPherson to round up. Mr. Couric, 5 minutes to you, sir.
Thanks very much, and Ms. Joseph, I really appreciate what you've shared here, because it's reasonable and realistic in terms of talking about an energy future that is based on what the world needs, not a pipe dream, not a fantasy, which I regret that quite often seems to be what bleeds from other political parties across the aisle. So I want to ask you very specifically, when it comes to reducing global emissions, is there a case for Canadian LNG to be part of that solution?
Yes. So because the world has been increasing its use of coal, and it's increasing its use of coal because it wants a high volume, low cost source of energy, the alternative to that has a lot of the same characteristics, but half the emissions, is natural gas. And LNG from Canada, which would be made with some of the highest methane, some of the highest emission mitigation. Many of the projects that are coming online are going to be electrified. So the lowest emission is how it's produced, going to displace these higher emitting fuels, which these countries continue to use. As I said, India has plans to double coal production by 2030, which is all for electricity generation. So that means major emissions increases, much more significant than Canada's emissions. And we have to look at what role can we play in that.
So the way that I see it is Canada can be left behind, and the world has the world's environment is worse off, or we can lead the world by making sure that we can get our energy to market. Now, I would ask, specifically when it comes to hydrogen, because I think there's this misnomer that it's hydrogen or natural gas. Can you comment on that it's not a binary thing, but it's hydrogen and natural gas? Could you comment on that quickly?
It's absolutely hydrogen and natural gas, and some of the first hydrogen that's going to come onto market and is starting to be developed in terms of projects, including in Alberta, are blue hydrogen projects that benefit from the carbon capture capacity and resource and geology, but then can be exported as ammonia. And that's an option that also exists, in the East. If people want to pursue it. And then, of course, in Eastern Canada, there's a lot of goals around green hydrogen, the use of wind to produce that. So there is no and or, because the goal is more. And what is going to fill that need for human access to affordable, reliable energy that countries are not compromising on.
And I appreciate that. And the goal is more, I think, is a great message that I hope my colleagues are listening to. And just one quick final question, and then I do hope to get to my friends at the Canadian cattle producers. Much of the tech associated with clean tech, green tech, however it is defined, is produced in jurisdictions with very poor environmental records. Are we accurately accounting for the emissions that go into the production of that technology? Just if you can, 10, 15 seconds. Sorry that it's short.
I don't think there's a lot of discussion about the supply chains and the environmental impacts, not just in terms of emissions, but in terms of water pollution, land, like the mining. There's a lot of environmental impacts associated with.
I hate to cut you off, but let's just leave it there and say more needs to be talked about. To my friends at the cattle producers, the WTO, other trade challenges, I just want to provide in the last minute or so, if you can talk about that, and specifically as a starting point for that, when the interim agreement with the UK was signed, one of your American counterparts, their comment to me was, y'all got screwed, at the same time when the Liberals were celebrating the ascension of this agreement. So I'm wondering if just in the last 60 seconds or so, if you can talk about some of the trade challenges that exist and the role that the WTO can play in terms of helping to mitigate some of those challenges within your sector, but if you can broaden it just about your knowledge more generally as well.
So as I said, we've utilized the WTO dispute settlement mechanism and have a precedent in one particular instance that we can and do reference when dealing with our trading relationship with really our largest partner. That's one scenario. Another scenario really is really addressing some of these challenges, these non-tariff barriers, right up front, on initiation of these agreements, and working obviously very very much in part with our trade negotiators to ensure that our concerns are being heard, and that we're really being represented in a fair agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Mr. Burke. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. I'm actually going to pass on my time. I've actually lost the thread of this as the Canada-China Committee, and particularly on the Indo-Pacific strategy. So it has lost relevance for me at this point, and I'm just going to pass on my time. Thank you.
All right, very good. Then we will wrap up then with Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes and Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Merci. Alors, j'aimerais...
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give Mr. Landsbergen an opportunity to respond to the question about the products that are not as popular in the West that might find a marketplace in the East.
Yes, so we do have a variety of different products. for example, clams and whether it be Arctic surf clam in the east or gooey duck in the west, we need to have more promotions of those products so that Canadians can taste the great seafood that we have across all the different species. We had a national marketing campaign the last 2 years to promote those variety of species. The website is still live, chooseseafood.ca. Smarter meals out of the blue is the tagline. And we profiled a number of different species to Canadians, largely millennials in large urban centers, because that allowed us to get the most efficiency in the dollars that we had available.
Et comment développer davantage les marques?
And how can you further develop the Asian markets, i.e. in terms of what they produce?
Sorry, I didn't get the...
Comment développer?
How can you further develop those Asian markets?
For Asia, certainly the new office is a great start. The offices from EDC that will help exporters to facilitate some of the shipments. We have the federal government and the provinces participating in trade missions. And so I think we do need federal and provincial elected officials to also go to these trade missions and trade shows. In Boston, back in March, we had 3 federal ministers, 4 premiers and their fisheries ministers, a 5th fisheries minister, all present in the Boston Seafood Show, which is for North America. If we could get even a part of that representation in Asia trade shows, I think that would be helpful as well.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen. Just as a side note, this committee will discuss, in fact, in the fullness of time, perhaps a bit of travel to some of the locations where we're attempting to build markets. We would be talking about that in the future, I'm sure, in the not too distant future, in fact. To wrap us up, we'll go to Ms. McPherson for our final 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses being here one more time. The final 2.5 minutes. You know what? I'm just going to start. Maybe, Mr. Fulton, is there anything that you would like to see in the final report from this committee on the Indo-Pacific strategy? And I'll just go through all of the witnesses. Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, specifically with respect to any future trade agreements, a focus on science and rules-based trade, as I've referenced before. It's critical for them to be quality for industry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen.
I think we've got a good start with the Indo-Pacific strategy. We need to continue implementing it and make sure it's long-term. 5 years isn't enough.
And probably more investment in that too. Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Joseph?
I think LNG needs to be integrated as a priority in how Canada wants to engage in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that on the emissions side, there are lots of opportunities for us to either work within mechanisms like Article 6 of the Paris Agreement or bilaterally with some of those Asian partners on and how those emissions are recognized and those emissions reductions are recognized. And I think all of that is part of a full picture that can be that LNG value proposition.
Certainly, we also need to recognize that the world needs climate action. So that's probably a good place to end today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.